for Andrew.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to another Cambridge Skeptics Live. Tonight we're going to be hearing Erica tell us all about the history of AIDS and HIV. I'm very much looking forward to finding out all about that. For those of you who don't know, Cambridge Skeptics is a not-for-profit community organisation founded to promote science, positive skepticism, and critical thinking skills via public engagement. If you have any questions, please post them in the chat. We will do our best to make sure answer them. If you have any comments, just let us know. And without any further ado, I will pass over to Erica to start her talk.
Awesome. And I hope it's more of a discussion than a talk too. So the origins of this comes out from a conversation that we were all having actually a few months ago, which is like, what are the weird rabbit hole things that you've become interested in during lockdown? And for me, I was thinking about our current pandemic situation. That got me thinking about past pandemic situations. And I started wondering about the origins of AIDS and HIV. I was born in the middle of the 1980s. And I was born in Canada. And so a lot of, what I know about HIV is stuff that I overheard on the news as a kid or whatever. Or there's these weird, artifacts of it that were kind of preserved or passed down to me, educational stories for kids about don't be afraid of the person with HIV. It's okay to use the same water fountain as them. And I'd be like, oh, that's a bit weird that they're telling us that. Why would we think it wasn't okay? So that was kind of
I think I'm 10 years older than you, so we were taught be afraid of the people with AIDS.
Right, yeah. That was the first reaction. So I was wondering about this, and I got interested in this kind of the science of how do we understand what the origins of HIV were? How do you and I guess my question is for you guys who before coming to talk about this today, what did you know about AIDS and its origins?
So I knew it came from, or sort of originated in Central Africa. I had a bit of a vague understanding. It might have been there for a little while before it sort of spread out. But then I suppose my understanding was that once it had gotten out, it had spread quite rapidly, and that it was sort of spread by communities who shared needles or had unprotected sex, essentially.
Yeah.
I think what I remember from what I was taught on the playground in the 80s, it came from someone having sex with a monkey in Africa.
Yeah, okay.
And that was about all I knew until I started researching for this subject today. I was amazed how long it has actually been around.
And I assume you didn't necessarily take that as at face value. You were
I was a kid. Of course I believed it. I was dumb. Have we not explored this before? I was dumb when I was younger. We have discussed it.
Suddenly today you're like, oh my God. Oh. Yeah, what about you, Andrew? Similar
sort of thing. Yeah. You'd hear about it in the news if a celebrity was involved or things like that. And there was definitely the impression that it was a disease that somehow affected people who were engaged in things they shouldn't be, or something like that. It was, it wasn't something that good, wholesome people needed to worry about necessarily. That's definitely how I remember it. From when I was a lot younger.
I remember the adverts on TV when I was a kid, and I was absolutely convinced if you had sex, you died. If you smoked, you died. If you drank alcohol, you died. If you had sex, you died. I was convinced, these are things you did not do.
Yeah, okay. And to this day, here you are.
Still, don't drink.
Yeah, so I
Hopefully
think
you can change my mind today, haven't I?
Maybe. Everyone should have sex all the time while smoking and drinking simultaneously.
You heard it first here on Cambridge Skeptics.
You heard it first here. And yeah, like I think like that's probably pretty similar to my own understanding before this. I presume we'd all heard of the phrase like patient zero too. Like I remember like I would use that phrase like with my group of friends if like one of us got sick and then everyone else would get sick. It was like, oh, you were patient zero.
No, I had no idea that was actually connected to HIV.
Yeah. So actually, then that's probably a good place to start in some ways, because that the origin of the phrase patient zero does come from HIV. And I think it, and by the way, again, just to state the obvious, HIV is the virus that causes the disease AIDS once the human who has HIV becomes sick enough that they present the physical symptoms of, immune system collapse. And the syndrome AIDS was the first thing that was recognized because people were dying of sort of mysterious wasting conditions. They were getting really thin and they were dying of these infections that the body should be able to fight off. And so, and they realized, well, their immune system is completely collapsed. And it wasn't until a few years of realizing that this was what was going on, that only then, a few years later, they identified that this actually caused by a single virus, which we now call HIV. So just getting clear on the terminology. So what was I talking about? I was talking about the origins of the phrase patient zero. So there's this idea that I think implied that, well, there was one person who, had sex with this monkey in Africa and is the cause of this outbreak. And the naming of this individual as patient zero, it actually happened because this syndrome AIDS was being recognized in the gay communities in San Francisco and New York City. And we can get into why it's the gay community, because there's actually a really good scientific reason why they're disproportionately affected by AIDS. And they were doing contact tracing of all of the sexual partners that people had. And there was this one flight attendant, and there have actually been like some pretty horrible things said about him since like after he died. And I don't want to quote them because they're sort of quoting what he would say about himself, but there's no evidence I don't have any evidence of what he said directly. But he had a surprisingly good recollection of all of his partners in a way that, like, I was not a gay man in San Francisco in the 1980s or New York. So I can only, I've only just been told what the culture was like, but there was this big like sexual liberation, right? People were able to have lots of partners very casually, and under much reduced stigma compared to the previous forever, until you get back to the Greeks. So it was a wonderful, wonderful liberating time. And
that would be the ancient Greeks, not just some random collection of
Yeah, specifically ancient Greeks. Sorry. My first degree is in classical archaeology, so obviously when I say Greeks, I mean ancient. Yeah. And so this guy, like, compared to like people where like you wouldn't even necessarily even know their name or you wouldn't know their last name, this guy had a really good recollection of all of his partners, and that was part of why they were able to link him to so many cases of AIDS. So that was part of why he got identified as this sort of key nexus in the transmission of AIDS or HIV, which they didn't necessarily know about at the time. The other reason is that they were doing contact tracing, and they were labeling whether people were from within California, from New York, and this guy was from outside of those areas. He was actually a French-Canadian flight attendant. And so he was labeled O because he was from outside California. And the O got mistranscribed as a zero, and that's how you end up with patient zero, which kind of makes sense when you think about it. So like, I don't know if you know programming languages, but there's that whole thing about whether it's a zero indexed language or a one indexed language. And like, I do both R and Python, and R is one indexed and Python is zero indexed. And like, you wouldn't necessarily, it's not necessarily, in other words, like counting, I should use a less nerdy example. It's like identifying the floor that you're on in North America or in Britain, right? There's no reason to start at 1 versus 0. It's just convention. So there's no reason why it had to be patient 0 rather than patient 1. Why would it, right? Like, that's not, we actually don't often count that way. It's 50-50. And the reason why it was 0 was because it was actually an O. So the part of the story that I'm interested in, though, is how do we get to this point where we have this virus circulating in certain populations in the United States in the 1980s or even earlier. And I was wondering, do you guys know, like, what was I going to say? Like, do you guys have off the top of your head what the relative risk is of catching HIV or transmitting HIV?
Yes. If you have sex, you die.
Right. So that's actually not true.
Right. Okay.
But like, yeah, do you have any sense about like how risky a single sexual act is? Like, off the top of your head, what would be your odds? Like, let's say your partner is HIV positive, you are not positive. One sexual act, what are your odds of getting HIV from them? Is it 100%?
I have no idea. I kind of want to say 25%, but I feel that that's either incredibly too high or incredibly too low. Not it's nowhere around that number, basically.
Enlighten us.
Yeah, so it's less than 1%. It's very low, and I should say that this is not an indication that you should all give up all of your protected sex. There's because presumably you're going to do it more than once, and you're going to look to be rolling the dice multiple times, and also because there's many other diseases that you're much more likely to get from a single act, so you might as well do it. Plus, until very recently, HIV was literally a death sentence, and like, would you play Russian roulette with those odds? Right? No, don't do it. Like, if you had like literally a loaded gun, would you take it? So, but what I think is interesting is actually, as a virus, HIV kind of sucks. Like, what were you gonna say?
Well, no, I did know that. I did know that as a virus, it's fairly weak. It's just there's no way of stopping it particularly, or rather, left untreated.
Yeah.
There's not really any, like, I think I've seen 1 or 2 cases of, or sort of claims of people being immune to it, but or recovering without drugs, but they're incredibly few and far between. It's just this incredibly slow sort of, almost this, that's what I'm looking for, trundling sort of disease. Like, it's inevitable, but it's not. It doesn't do an awful lot until it absolutely has decimated you. Yeah.
And I don't know if you guys know, so like, I think we might know that HIV is of a type of virus called a retrovirus. You might know that because the drug treatments that are used to treat it are antiretroviral drugs. Which, does that make them viral drugs? Is it anti-retro? I'm probably not.
No, they just don't like old stuff.
Yep.
Oh, retro, yeah, hipster.
Yeah. Anti-hipster.
Anti-hipster, yeah. But within that, it belongs to the subclass of viruses now called lentiviruses, and it's from the Latin lentus, meaning slow. So, like, the name for the virus is literally like does not reproduce itself quickly in its host, which is why it takes so long to die from it. Like, again, if you compare it to our current pandemic, we're reporting statistics on deaths within 28 days of a positive test. With HIV, it's 10 years. So it's a very, very different kind of virus. What's interesting, so getting back to that question of like, this virus is not great at infecting us. Very, very deadly. Do not take risks. but it's not awesome at infecting us. It doesn't have a 100% transmission rate. The highest transmission rate that there is through a blood transfusion. Where, direct blood to blood, significant amounts of blood being shared. That's up at 90%, which is really significant. So when we're looking for things that are much more likely to transmit HIV, we're looking at things that have significant risk of blood to blood contact. And that's where, I'm not going to get into details here because we want to keep this PG-13, or what's the British equivalent?
No, PG-13.
PG-13.
That is it.
Okay, but I'm not going to get into the details, but basically, depending on the type of sexual act that you are doing, that changes your risk. And if you look at particularly male homosexual sexual acts, those come with a much higher risk of transmission, like potentially. Sorry?
Yeah, I was going to say, that was my understanding of sort of where really kind of the sexual risk came from, actually, is that it was that there might be a small cut or something whilst you're having sex that could allow transmission.
Exactly. And it's much more likely to happen. And so, like, with the statistics, like, I just got the Wikipedia article for the rates of, like, the chance of infection, but potentially it's up to 10 times higher for homosexual men. And that then starts to explain why you have these population structural differences. And it's even higher. It's not even higher. I must misread the decimal place. But it's a similarly high level of risk and consistently high level of risk, relatively speaking, for needle sharing drug users. So again, that's the scientific explanation of why we have these groups of people who are disproportionately prone to HIV or disproportionately likely to contract HIV through the activities that they're doing. So you won't die as soon as you do it, but it is
10 years later.
Yeah. Well, it's a lot higher risk depending on the type of activity that you're doing. So that explains why we've got these populations. We're back in the United States in the 1980s. We've got these we've got these populations who are dying from a mysterious illness, but they are not people who have power. What was the date of I know that in the history of like gay rights in the United States, it's the Stonewall riots were a big turning point in gay rights, and that was in 1969. So let's call that 10, 11, 12 years earlier. That's nothing. I've been in the UK for longer than that. And look at me. Look at my accent, right? That's nothing.
Yeah. You're not British yet.
Not British yet.
That's what you're saying.
Yeah. The Home Office is going to kind of come get me. I've been on a visa the whole time, I promise. But yeah, so I think that's really interesting. So then the question is, hang on. You've just told us that this virus sucks at reproducing itself, and it's not great at infecting people. And if I have a vague impression of the history of gay rights, I'm pretty sure that Central Africa was not a hotbed of LGBT, promoted safe activity in the early 20th century.
So how did it get from Central Africa to the US?
How did it get from Central Africa to the US? And how did it even, and to answer that question, you have to ask yourself, how did it build up enough of a reservoir in the population in Central Africa to get to the point where it could infect someone in the US? That's the question that I put before you. And the reason why I'm focusing on the US isn't just my bias as someone from North America. It's also because for most of the rest of developed countries and most of the rest of the world, actually outside of Africa, they can trace the genetic origin of the strains of HIV that they have back to strains of HIV that became dominant in the US.
Okay, so it went from Central Africa to the US and then from the US to much of the rest of the Western world, it seems.
Generally speaking, that's the general flow of it. Obviously, there are interesting exceptions and but that's generally what happens. So the UK's strains are pretty dominantly imported from the US. And again, quite early on due to close contacts between those countries. And also similarly, like gay rights movements, but that there were at similar stages of evolution at this around the same time, which led to like the transmission opportunities between those two communities, I would say.
So you've explained 2 of the 4 H's, heroin users and homosexuals. What about the other 2?
Yes. So and this 4-H thing, this comes like, so like, I don't know, Chris, like, did you hear it get called the 4-H disease? This was
I heard it in It's a Sin a couple of weeks ago.
And It's a Sin. Is it good, by the way? Would you recommend it?
Yeah, it was very good.
Nice. I'll check it out. Yeah, so we got the 4 H's. It stands, and this is back when we've got this mysterious disease. We don't know why these people are dying. And they started looking at the demographics of the people who are dying. So it's homosexuals, it's hemophiliacs, and other intravenous drug users, right? That's the blood connection coming through there. What's the other H for? And I've forgotten.
Haitians and heroin users.
Haitians and heroin users, right? So the heroin users we've covered because of the drug use. Hemophiliacs, that's covered tragically by blood transfusions and the massive amounts of blood products that are needed to treat someone with hemophilia over the course of their lives. So I will get into that. That's actually kind of a later part of the story about how sort of medical blood ended up being an important part of the transmission story. But then Haitians. So working backward in the story, how did it end up in the United States? It did not come directly from Central Africa. It came via Haiti. And that's when you see, that's why people with Haitian connections started to be identified in the US as a potential community that was connected to HIV, or AIDS rather, as it would have been known at the time. Why? Like literally, like why would this one island in the Caribbean have a huge influx of HIV or AIDS? What makes it different? Like, what do you guys know about Haiti?
I know it's destitute.
Yeah, it's a poor country.
Poor country. I don't know if that then leads to intravenous drug use, meaning that it can spread easily within the population.
Yeah. And do you guys know anything else about Haiti? They had an earthquake there.
Yeah. Other than that.
Yeah.
Not really, no.
They
speak French speaking.
They're French speaking, exactly. This becomes important. They're French speaking.
It's the French's fault. Okay.
Oh yeah, no, well, Belgians eventually.
yeah, exactly. But they're French speaking, and they are also have a history of being a former slave colony that was freed, that they freed themselves, right, in their history. So suddenly we're seeing a bit of a connection to colonial Central Africa possibility. What do we have going on in Central Africa? We've got a bunch of former French-speaking colonies in the middle of the 20th century gaining their independence. And as they're gaining their independence, I'm talking specifically about the Democratic Republic of Congo, they ask for help from the international community. And the Haitians, feeling a disproportionate connection to these people because of shared cultural history, they come in to help. And that's how the Haitian connection gets started. But then I think we face an interesting question, which is, but hang on, how does it build up so quickly? So the DRC declared independence around 1960. And by 1981, people are dying, dropping dead in the US. We know it takes 10 years. How do you build up this much virus after a couple of people get off a plane? Given what we know about the rates of transmission, like, are people just like having lots and lots and lots of sex with a bunch of different people all the time, but just in Haiti? Probably not. Like, I think there's a little bit of an element of gay tourism happening in Haiti that's potentially playing a role, but it doesn't seem to be able to explain the spread of HIV, especially in the spread of people who are not homosexual. within Haiti. Like if you go back and you look at older blood samples, or you look at people who got infected earlier. So one hypothesis is that in medical technology in the middle to late 20th century, there was a great need for blood products to treat things like hemophilia, to provide blood transfusions. And while we were playing around with like, what's the best model? How do we get blood, basically? They were like, well, why don't we just pay people for blood and we'll just get it from them like milk from a cow? Like, what could go wrong? Turns out the sort of people who sign up for that are the sort of people who don't have money-making opportunities in other areas. And so you end up with people who are more likely to be sick because they're disadvantaged. And you end up with people, because of the pressure to make money through this system, potentially reusing supplies and things like that. So there's an argument that a lot of the blood needs from the US were actually being met by one company based in Haiti. And that could have, there's no case really strong yes or no, but it's a potential contributing factor for how the viral load in the population got built up to the amount that it did. And what's really interesting is that we just didn't really understand viruses at the same time. Like I know there was a big deal about hepatitis C as well. Like it was in the news in Canada when I was growing up because like people were getting compensated for being treated mistakenly infected with hepatitis C during blood transfusions. And it's actually, hepatitis C is actually a really interesting way to understand the science here, because hepatitis C doesn't kill people as nearly as much or as quickly as AIDS does. And so you can look at living populations today and measure their rates of hepatitis C. And you can use that then as a proxy for how those same populations might have been affected by HIV for similar medical transfusion reasons, or like medical contamination reasons, which is interesting. So there is some evidence that, yes, we've got a concentration of hepatitis C cases around this blood donor center. And so it's also likely that then there were also HIV cases spreading as well, but we're less likely to be able to measure the people who got infected with HIV in the 60s because they are sadly literally all dead, which is horribly tragic. But like you can say that with absolute certainty.
Yeah. I mean, assuming they were in their 20s or older, they'd be pretty old already. But yes, they would have died for the time.
Yeah, exactly. So that's how you get to this population in Haiti. You've got the combination of potentially sexual tourism as well as prostitution, because that's fairly human, universal, constant. And you've got potentially some medical practices that are increasing the odds of transmission. Because remember, the contaminated needles are much more likely to spread HIV than heterosexual intercourse. And even though we don't have great statistics about this, the population is far more likely to be engaging in heterosexual intercourse than homosexual intercourse, just on a like person-to-person, basis. So it's really some kind of additional explanation like this medical blood clinic seems to be required to justify to model the numbers and make them make sense, which is interesting. And that leads us then back to Africa, because you have to ask yourself the same question. How did we then build up enough of the virus within Central Africa for it to be able to infect these Haitians that were coming over to help with the newly independent colony and country, and helping them to build up their like government understanding and these sort of like intellectual things, this intellectual resource that they lacked. And what I want to get into, again, I'm going to keep it PG-13, but I want to get into a bit about like the structure of prostitution, just for fun, because there's a lot of different structures under which like prostitution, or actually transactional sex is another way to talk about it, with the phrase that has less stigma attached to it. There's different forms that this can take. and the form that it takes massively affects your risk. There's sort of high risk forms of transactional sex and low risk forms of transactional sex. So the form that was practiced in Central Africa in the early 20th century, before the sort of rapid urbanization that was happening in the sort of decolonializing period, was pretty low risk. It was like, and everything that I've read has been from a heterosexual perspective as well, which I think is interesting. That's not just necessarily to say that there wasn't homosexual activities going on, but it's not present in the literature that I was reading. I'm sure there could be evidence. You know, my research was not exhaustive, let's say. But so let's say you've got one woman who has 3 boyfriends and she's with them for like 5 years. And the reason why this is happening is because of the colonial practices in the area that's the city that's now known as Kinshasa. And it's actually, so it's split. The city is split along a river. On the one side, it's Kinshasa. On the other side, it's Leopoldville. Oh, I might be getting that wrong. I gotta double check this. Anyways, you have this split city, and the one half of the colony, the one half is in the Belgian colony, the other half is in the French colony. But both of the colonial governments were massively restricting who could live in the city. You had to have a permit to live in the city, and they didn't want women in the city, especially unmarried women, because they were trying to prevent prostitution from happening and like these illicit activities. So of course, what happens? Prostitution. Because like there's all these young men working in the city and they can't find a wife because there's no women in the city. And so it drives prostitution, if anything. But what tends to happen is that they'll basically like, it's almost more of a like a polygamous, like a weird like polygamous marriage where like this woman just has 3 different boyfriends and she like rotates her time with them, and she does like cooking and cleaning and these other kind of like domestic activities. That's more the form that it's taking in the early 20th century.
And so to use a term we've all become familiar with recently, the chains of transmission are between any 2 people significantly longer, if not completely broken, because actually the number of people that you're likely to have relations with after contracting the virus is relatively small, and presumably fairly contemporary, like in age. So it becomes more difficult to kind of not only to infect the next generation, but the next generation of a similar age that you were infected.
Yeah. Like it's really hard to have a whole population get infected with HIV when you've got this woman with her 3 boyfriends and they're together, you know, in a stable relationship for like 5 years, and then maybe one of them leaves and she gets another one, you know. So it's not the kind of high risk prostitution that you're seeing in the later half of the 20th century, where you've got like this very sad statistic, but it's something like on average 3 clients a day, and or 1,000 men a year per woman. Yeah. So there, that's enough. Yeah, exactly. Like that's a structure where you can start to see these really big cases, like really large amounts of HIV positive cases start building up. But before then, it doesn't seem like that was the kind of prostitution that was being widely practiced in these Central African colonies during the first half of the 20th century. So when there is a shift as the country gains independence, there's massive urbanization, and a lot of the stability provided by the colonial government disappeared. There were like military coups and things like that, and you see a switch to this much more high risk form of prostitution that does happen. But the virus was already there in significant quantities, enough that it could just go boom. And then you get the Haitians on the plane, and they're back in Haiti, blood products, boom. So how do you get there? How does it go from the monkey?
So how did it get to Leopoldville and Brazzaville?
Brazzaville, that's it. So Leopoldville is modern Kinshasa. Yeah. And Brazzaville, it was the other one, and that's, yeah, okay, great. Thank you. So how do we know the origins of the HIV virus? Do you guys know about molecular dating?
Yes, I'm an expert in it. No, nothing.
I have never dated a molecule.
No, dating molecule. So molecular dating is it's when you've got like let's say DNA, right? Like HIV is just a strain of DNA, or it has a genetic code. Mutations occur naturally in a population, right? Like this has been the thing since Darwin that we've all been testing and proving that it happens. Mutations occur naturally in a population, and by mutations we literally mean like one of the G's or A's or T's or C's in the genetic code swaps itself accidentally for another one. There's just a replication error, a bit like how, and like kids these days won't know this, but like when you used to photocopy stuff, and like over time the photocopier, with the photocopied sheet of paper would get like crappier and crappier as you photocopy it multiple times. That's what's happening with DNA. So imagine that I give you a piece of paper that's a photocopy. I give you two pieces of paper, one of which is very pristine, the other of which has lots of black dots all over it. You can tell which one's older, right? It's the one with all the weird artifacts that's got these sort of like transmission errors. And imagine you could do a study where you just photocopy something loads and loads of times and check how long it takes to gather these different types of errors. You could then actually work backwards and say, we actually not only do we know that one is older than the other, we know how much older it is. So that's basically how molecular dating works, is we examine the changes in the genetic sequence of two different pieces of DNA, and we compare that to the known rate of mutation that's going to occur. And that allows us to see how much time must have elapsed before those two things were the same, or came from the same original source. Because they must have, there was one replication event that tried to make two copies of that DNA, and some errors got introduced there. And from then on, and then on, and then on, more errors happened. We want to know, when was that first time that it happened?
I did find out, whilst doing a little research for this, a curious artifact that would have made this a little bit difficult, which is that when HIV is transmitted, there is a bias towards the original infection, like the original virus that is infected. So whilst it will mutate in the body, what you'll pass, if you were HIV infected, what you pass on to someone else is much more likely to be, or is likely to be more similar to what you originally got infected with than what is actually necessarily prevalent in your body, which seems really weird to me. I don't have the science to understand how, but
this virus really is not doing it right, is it?
Well, no, but it makes it difficult to mutate.
Yeah,
exactly. It makes it very, very stable, very slow.
That's interesting. Yeah, and I guess like that explains why, again, like we're familiar with other viruses, say, that have lots of new variants cropping up. Oh, hello, kitty. I saw that. Lots of new variants cropping up like every few months. The same sort of thing is happening with HIV. And the question for us really is, well, can we work backwards and work out that one copy of the virus that came from the animal into humans for the first time?
The guy who screwed the monkey.
All right, let's get on to that. Because what did I tell you guys about sexual intercourse?
It's unlikely to be the source.
Yeah, so that wasn't what happened. And so that's why...
That's good.
So for a bunch of reasons, we don't think that's very likely. Instead, it's much more likely. We know that populations in Central Africa hunt apes for food. And what happens when you're hunting, there's butchering involved, there's sharp implements, and there's a lot of blood. So the most likely scenario is that a hunter cut, presumably himself, while butchering an ape, or specifically a chimpanzee. And that was how the first copies of HIV got into humans. And we know this because of all of the genetic testing that has been done on HIV strains. We can compare the genetics from the human strains We can compare it to the very similar ape version of HIV, which is known as SIV, or simian immunodeficiency virus. And we can say, whoa, not only do we know that it came from monkeys, we know that it came from this specific group of chimpanzees in this part of Central Africa, because they have the most similar version of SIV to the oldest HIV samples that we have today. And interestingly, there are these two really important these HIV positive blood samples that were taken from Kinshasa in 1959 and 1960. And they contain HIV in them. So they are two early reference points. And that allows us to say, oh, we've got these two reference points. Let's figure out how long ago they split off from each other. So that gives us a date for when this cut hunter might have hurt himself, of around sort of 1910-ish. There's big error bars, between 1900 and 1920, that sort of thing. But that's approximately when that first transmission event. That's one person. Now, what is that one person going to do? Is that one person coincidentally a prostitute who is going to then have 1,000 sexual partners that year? Very unlikely, especially where we know about traditional Central African family structures, right?
Yeah.
That was almost certainly not the case. So very likely that chain of transmission would have ended.
Yeah. So what you're saying is there's multiple, and it's not one infection. There's multiple infections, and is there any evidence that actually there was?
Let me go back on that, because what does multiple infections do?
No.
And how does it increase the odds? It increases the odds, but we still need one strain of the virus to make it. So I'm saying, yes, there could have been multiple hunters that had multiple cats, and then they died out, and the strain didn't go anywhere. But we know that there was a strain, and it made it to Kinshasa in 1960. How did it? We know that happened.
Okay.
How did it get there?
Someone came down river and sold stuff. I guess people move.
Yeah, exactly. But this is the thing: is imagine these unurbanized communities, right? They're living in villages. They have traditional marriage structures. There's probably some polygamy happening, and maybe some intramarital affairs. Let's be realistic. And maybe they're even moving around because of the French and Belgian colonial governments, right? Another interesting thing is that the First World War happened, and there was action of troops, of Central African troops, moving through the Belgian Congo, right through this area where this cut hunter would have lived.
And I suppose they could have been drafted, and
yeah, they were.
Yeah. So what I think I'm saying is that mechanism, there has to be something that is kicking people out of their traditional way of life around this time, and we know that it's happening, and that's why it happened in 1910 and not 1700, and not Okay,
right?
So that's what you're saying, is that actually there might have been hundreds of or thousands of years of infection that just stayed local, because it being a shitty virus that doesn't transmit very well.
Yeah.
Actually, it just wasn't able to get out of this kind of local rut.
Yeah.
I read that when they tested some tribes people in that area, they found lots of antibodies from various strains in their blood. So this has obviously happened a lot of times throughout history.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it was just this one HIV-1 clade M that took off.
So
yeah.
It sounds like what you're hinting at is similar to the thing you had in Haiti, where you had the people giving infected blood, which then got passed on. There's some other aspect of the story that played a role that took it from being a local infection to
yeah, that's exactly it. And I think part of it was, as Sam said, it was well, this guy is suddenly this one cut hunter goes to Kinshasa and has sex with a prostitute, and that explains everything. As we've said, that's really unlikely to have happened because of the structures of sexual relationships at this time. That couldn't explain the numbers. So what else is going to be amplifying this virus? Yes, it's probably a factor. Like a person having 5 sexual partners is 5 times the spread of having 1 sexual partner, or 0, right? It's infinitely more, right? Because if you're just having 1 sexual partner, you're done, right? It's just
it depends if they're only having 1 sexual partner.
Yeah. But sorry, like monogamous relationships, right? So like, yes, the male-female ratio in the cities did have an impact on the spread because it did encourage multiple sexual partners, and there was some effect there.
But
there was something else, and that was probably the medical program sponsored by the colonial government, both the French and the Belgian, that used what we know now to be unsafe needle sharing practices, but they literally did not know what virus. They barely knew what viruses were. You know, how do you know your needle sharing program is working successfully?
I mean, this is before the discovery of DNA.
Yeah, you know that there's not like pus coming out of the womb 3 days later. Like that's good enough. You know, so they're sterilizing the needle with a bit of alcohol, but that's not enough to kill viruses. Or at least this virus, especially like 'cause there's like a little bit of blood left in the needle. Basically, like that's the problem. And the colonial governments were really keen on eradicating tropical diseases from this population. And so they were going through these massive immunization programs, and sometimes an entire unit of nurses going out from village to village. They would have 5 needles each.
I read one report from one of these nurses. She estimated she inoculated 80,000 people with 6 syringes.
Yeah, exactly. And like I think the important caveat here is that in no way does this impact on my own personal or any of our like willingness to get a vaccine today. Like we are all like, sign me up as soon as we're eligible.
I've got mine tomorrow.
I mean, this is.
Congratulations.
But the issue is not with the vaccine. The issue is with needle practices 100 years ago.
Yeah, exactly.
Colonial needle practices 100 years ago.
Colonial needle practices and just purely like a perfect storm of unintended consequences. Really, is what's going on. So that had a huge role in amplifying the rates of HIV in the population. How do we know this? Again, we look at hepatitis C in people who were getting these infections in the 1930s and 40s, and we see, they had a much higher rate of hepatitis C infection. We didn't know what HIV was or what AIDS was. We were very likely to confuse it with other conditions. But by the 70s, by the 80s, by the 90s, we were able to see hepatitis C in these populations, and that's what makes us think if they were getting hepatitis C, and then it's the people who were immunized are much more likely to have had hepatitis C. So that also makes us think that they were very likely to also be transmitting HIV this way, which is really interesting. So that's how we go from the guy having sex with the monkey, which was not how it happened, the guy who cut himself while hunting. And he wasn't just the first guy who cut himself while hunting, he was just the guy who cut himself while hunting in the right place at the right time, and also probably with the right strain of the simian HIV, or this like the SIV, because the strain that he got happened to be particularly good at evading the human immune system, like better than other potential strains as well. Combine that with the First World War and with with the local populations being conscripted, combine it with prostitution, combine it with unsafe, unsterilized needles being used in immunization. 53 million people are dead.
Maybe don't smile so much.
It's just my face. It's just where my face goes.
But yeah, so that takes it and makes it endemic in Kinshasa, and then you start getting serious levels of travel and aid from Haiti, and then from Haiti into the US and the US elsewhere.
And there's one remaining mystery that my brain clocked onto, and I don't have an answer for this. I don't think there is an answer for this. And that's the case of a teenager in Missouri in the US. And like Missouri is like in the middle, in the South, in the middle. Like it's not a big place. It's and he was living in St. Louis, Missouri. He checked himself into a hospital in 1966. And by 1968, when he was only 15, so he checked himself in when he was 15. He said that he had had these symptoms for at least 2 years previously. He died 1 year later. And the things that they observed in him when he died includes a very rare type of cancer that basically only flourishes in extremely immunocompromised people. It's called Kaposi's sarcoma, and it is listed when people are trying to diagnose AIDS before HIV testing. It is listed as a diagnostic criteria. Like if you have this, it's enough to prove that you have AIDS. He had this in 1968, died from it tragically in 1969. Way before this flight attendant is hanging out in San Francisco. This kid is 1,000,000 miles away from San Francisco. I mean, not literally, but like it's so.
Yeah, how on earth it could have, if he did get it from San Francisco, it's a crazy story.
He never left the state, according to him. And like, how does this 15-year-old kid who's very poor go to San Francisco when he's 15, right? He says he's never been.
I mean, is there a chance he had a different autoimmune condition?
Well, I mean, yeah, like I think that's the question. Like, it's an interesting question for us as skeptics as well. And like the doctors, I mean, so his blood samples, tissue samples were taken at the time, and they were in 1987. They were identified as containing HIV, but
okay.
Those tests weren't necessarily definitive. And ideally what you'd want to do is retest the samples. They were lost in Hurricane Katrina. They were moved to New Orleans and lost in Hurricane Katrina. So we'll never know, we'll never be able to retest the samples. So what do you as skeptics make of this situation?
Is there the possibility of vertical transmission from the mother?
How would his mother have gotten it?
I don't know. I don't know anything about her.
she
You just told me about
Missouri?
him. Maybe she left Missouri.
No, there's no evidence that she, like, I can understand, like, if his mother was, like, a Haitian nurse who had been to the Congo. Yeah.
Well, I take it we have no, because in the notes you sent us beforehand, you said about him suffering from several sexually transmitted infections. Yeah. And you also mentioned him being extremely poor, which does kind of make me think some kind of prostitution is probably involved. And while he may not have been out of the state, all it would take was someone who's gone to San Francisco, engaged in these activities, and come back and then engaged in activities with this young chap. Yeah. I mean, yeah, it's I would say something like that. You're talking, there's a carrier somewhere who's infected.
And even then it's really early though.
It is, but it's
became independent in 1960.
But is there a chance that there was a flight attendant or a medical practitioner who came from Missouri, went somewhere else, then ended up on the flight to Kinshasa and came back and was visiting family or something, and just happened to have you said that it's low from the odds are low from sex, but not
zero. So,
it could well actually, if anything, it would be odd if there weren't a small number of cases like this where you're just sat there kind of scratching your head as to exactly how, just particularly if it has been sort of present in the population since
and the other thing is, although where he was living in St. Louis in Missouri is like not a city that like either of us are necessarily, any of us is that aware of, it was a hub for a big US airline. So the flight attendant thing, is plausible, I guess. Yeah. Or
So we're still blaming a flight attendant. So.
Yeah, I was going to say, like, other flight crew, no, don't want it specifically flight attendants are the problem. You know them. No. Hey, whatever I'm going to say is going to be terrible, so I'm not going to say it. I mean, like, what a horrible story. Like, I don't want to dwell too much on the, like, you know, tragedy porn of, like, this poor kid, but, like, you know, it is obviously, like, a deeply sad story. But I think more the thing that really interests me is it almost fits with the timeline, but not quite. And isn't it interesting how we don't have any cases that are like completely like, oh no, we've got someone dying of HIV in 1910 in the US. Like there's not, well, I haven't heard of any cases like that or that are like completely impossible. It could, like, it could just fit. It's just the right combination of unlucky things happened.
And particularly if he was already immunosuppressed or compromised because of other illnesses, his timeline could have been accelerated.
Yeah. But I think I think it's like an interesting story to put kind of your skeptical hats on for, as well as to say, as well as like to think about like all of the other sort of AIDS-related conspiracy theories that are going on, and how, you know, like for example, when you look at the genetic evidence for the HIV virus or the SIV virus, the version in the chimpanzees, you know, there's some conspiracy theories, even though like temporarily had a little bit of legitimate science sort of support, that because the colonial medical practitioners were doing experiments on chimpanzees to see how to figure out how to treat these tropical illnesses, could that have exacerbated the spread of this variant of HIV? And the answer is no. There have never been any positive SIV infected chimpanzees in any of the tissue that's been preserved from those experiments. Plus, the version of SIV that we have is far more closely relates to that one group, that one wild troop of chimpanzees, rather than any other population.
And retroviruses weren't even identified until the 70s, were they?
Well, so this gets me on to, like, if you want to find out more about this topic, there's a book which goes into quite a lot of detail, and it's by actually another French-Canadian researcher. He's very interesting to talk about the origins of HIV, because he himself was a French-speaking doctor who volunteered in Central Africa in the DRC in the 80s. And so he's very uniquely equipped to research the colonial history of medical practices in that part of the world. So that book I recommend. If you're not interested in diving into a book like with loads of like tables and statistics, like, you know, stuff like that, there are some great podcast episodes that I recommend. There is a Radiolab episode that's an American podcast that came out now almost, I think, like 10 years ago, but it's called Patient Zero. And it tells 3 different stories about the origins of something, but one of them is about the origins of HIV. There's also a more recent, made in the last year, BBC podcast called The Jump, which looks at 3 different stories of animal to human virus transmissions, and HIV is one of them. There is also a podcast from Sam and my favorite, Malcolm Gladwell, which looks at the research behind identifying HIV and the sort of science behind the virology of identifying it as a virus, and that exact thing of like, we didn't even know that this class of virus existed. And it tells the story of these people working on these really unsexy viruses that nobody cared about. And then suddenly in 1980s, it's like, hello, we need you. So that was cool. And so his podcast is called Revisionist History. And the episode that I'm talking about is, it's like the unpopular virus
club. The Obscure Virus Club. I'll stick it in
the Obscure Virus Club. That's it.
All of these things will go in the link in the the box below.
Exactly. So I mean, that was I think this has been an awesome talking to you guys. Like, this is literally everything that I've been thinking about HIV and why the origin story is such an interesting, like, scientific and also skeptical topic for us to think about. Super relevant today for us, like, given what we're living through, but also just like a wonderful, interesting, tragic human story that I think we should all know about.
Okay.
But there are definitely sort of some parallels in that it, you know, comes, well, as with all viruses, it's come from, you know, it's come from the world. It's come in, it's jumped that barrier. But other than that, actually, the parallels are incredibly. They're for few and far between. In that, the current virus is far more infectious and far more fast acting,
and far less deadly. Yeah.
But
there was one interesting story I came across while I was researching this, and it's the lead US federal AIDS researcher was a guy by the name of Anthony Fauci. And he wrote this ill-advised article about how it might be possible that the virus could be passed in close contacted households. And some newspaper picked this up, ran with it, blew it out of proportion. And this ended up with the police in New York being issued face masks. Completely pointless. And yeah, I'm just hoping the anti-maskers don't get a hold of that story.
Wow.
Right. Well, thank you very much, Erica. That was really interesting. There's, I certainly learned an awful lot. And if Sam, Chris, do you have any more questions before we wrap up? Or
do you want to talk us through next 2 fortnights?
Oh yeah, what's happening?
Yes.
What's happening
Okay.
next?
So we will be back in 2 weeks. We're aiming to stick to a 2-weekly schedule. And next time, which will be Tuesday, the 18th of May, I'm going to be talking about conspiracy theories, primarily the psychology behind conspiracy theories. So all make sure you get your tinfoil hats ready for that. And yes, that's it for now. So thank you very much for joining us. Thank you, Sam, Erica, and Chris. And we'll see you all in 2 weeks' time.